Your moderator for this session is going to be Chris Lewis. He's a highly regarded and experienced telecoms analyst with over 30 years in this industry. He has a reputation, according to his Twitter bio, for irreverent and open opinions, so we're looking forward to some challenging questions from Chris. He also works for vision-impaired charities with a focus on technology. He's going to be talking to JP Rangaswamy. He's the chief scientist at Salesforce.com. And JP is going to give us some insights into what really makes the digital world tick and the success of Salesforce.com, what really the suits need to learn and quickly from the likes of Silicon Valley. A little bit about JP. He's a one-time economist and financial journalist. He spent 33 years in the information technology industry, so even longer than Chris. He was ranked 4th in the Computer Weekly's 2013 list of the most influential people in IT. That's 4th. And I can really recommend his blog, Confused of Calcutta. So just in case you're unclear on that, Chris is the suit and JP will be the sneakers for the purpose of this session. All right, Chris, JP, please join me on the stage.
And good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to be a part of TM Forum Live. I'm delighted to welcome on stage JP Rangaswamy, who's going to talk to us a bit about his experience, having worked both in the more of a traditional business area with BT, and now as his role with the Chief Science Officer with Salesforce.com. And I think, JP, you're going to take us through a sort of 50-minute presentation, then we'll have 50-minute Q&A. And to repeat David's comment, please do send us tweets. I will stick a little earphone in and my iPhone will read out to me the tweets that are coming through from the different people. I'm sure there are. David mentioned I'm somewhat irreverent sometimes in terms of my attitude. I suspect there may be a few sacred cows that we're going to upset during the course of the presentation and the analysis and how we move forward. So without any further ado, JP Rangaswamy, please join on the lectern.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. When I was discussing the topic for today with Chris, one of the first things that came to mind was that I worked for a boss who wasn't one or the other, he was both. Right? He wore a suit and he wore sneakers. That's him on stage last year. We live in an age where, as Chris just said, it's possible for him to read tweets in his ear. We live in an age where we already have a huge change from what life used to be like when Thomas Watson said, I think maybe there's a market for 5 computers, or Ken Olsen asked, why would everyone have a PC in the home? Or Bill Gates asked, why would everyone want to be connected to the internet? These sort of questions, I'm paraphrasing them, but today we live in an age where if I could see the audience, I'd ask how many people actually have more than one device with them in their travel. Because the idea of people being connected is not new anymore. But change is taking place still at a pace where I have 3 children, 2 of them have left home. When all of them lived at home and the home phone rang, they would walk by serenely because it's not for them. And the 2 that have left home don't have a landline, never had one. They don't know what this is either, right? Not just in terms of a fat device, but they don't even use a traditional TV. They think that their sort of phablet is what's going to drive their watching of TV. These are fairly big changes. And the kind of changes, in order for us to have a mindset that works, I'm reminded of something that one of my favorite economists said, that every economic era is characterized by its own scarcities and its own abundances. And the business model that takes advantage of both the scarcities as well as the abundances is the one that's going to succeed. So do we live in an age where, connectivity is an abundance, but privacy is a scarcity? That access by customer to company is an abundance, but access by company to customers becomes scarcity. Attention is harder to get. Loyalty is harder to get. What does it mean to operate in that? So moving from an abundance to a scarcity view is important. In doing that, we have to understand some of the social aspects of the changes taking place. That's Lily. She's one of our cats. And yes, there's an app for that. She plays on my iPad. The reason it's important is not because Lily's playing with the iPad and there's an app, but because we have removed the keyboard, which was a latency and a friction between human beings engaging with information for the last 100 years. And we now finally live at an age where it's not just touch, it's not just gesture, it's not just sound, it's all of them. We are beginning on a day-to-day basis to engage with information using our senses and not necessarily artificial barriers to those senses. We don't have the QWERTY type barriers anymore, and that's changing how people engage. Why you see videos of one-year-olds playing with technology is because they no longer have the barriers they used to have. When everyone's connected, you have to start realizing that the generation that we live in is a generation that views things differently. I don't need to sort of labor the point, but we have to understand that things have changed. You know, that the post-space invaders generation, the people who never understood life before the web, think of things differently. When we do that, we should also remember the naysayers need to be kept in their place, right? Every time there is a technology, there is an argument that everyone gets antisocial, doesn't talk to everybody else. But we had that kind of behavior long before we had mobile phones, right? How many times have you traveled in some sort of, public transport where no one's talking to each other, immersed in a technology of their choice at the time? In the same way, knowing something about people. I grew up in Calcutta, and I could, at the age of 6, go to the local shop, buy a packet of cigarettes, and go home. And he served me because he knew the cigarettes were my dad. He didn't need money from me. He knew where I lived, where my dad lived, where my granddad lived, what we did, what we didn't do. It was normal and natural for businesses to actually know their customers and customers to have a relationship with business. This isn't new. It's been an aberration that you could scale up and have so-called relationships and not know your customers. Knowing your customer isn't a nice thing to do. It's the minimum you would have in sort of respect and being able to listen. One of the things that has happened as everyone's got devices is that the distance between the customer and the company has sharply reduced. But the distance between the company and the customer is still up for grabs, because not all the companies are learning how to engage with the customer, how to listen. We can use terms like customer centricity, but making it happen requires some transformative work. We used to know who our neighbors were. Now we appear to celebrate times when you have no idea who your neighbors are. We've always had people who pried, but in the past we knew who those people were, right? If you lived in a town or village, you knew whose house to avoid, who was the local gossip. If you're going to walk home late at night, you took the long route home, because otherwise your mother would tell, or at least my mother would tell me, if you carry on like this, JP, none of your sisters is going to be able to get married. So the social construct of these things did matter. The people of today share, and designing to share is part and parcel what we have to do if you want to get close to the customer. You have to make it possible for the customer to share. The idea that everything you do has icons that say, save, print, send to A, B, C, D, do this with it. Part of how people engage with each other is by being social, and the tools for being social have to be designed. When they share anything, including who their network is. And that's one of the biggest single transformations that I can see taking place today, that you have the ability to find out what your network of trust thinks about something that you want to do, buy, see, eat, read, whatever, because the cost of finding out what your friends think of something has sharply reduced. You no longer need endorsement. Celebrity endorsement was effectively a proxy to say, it's too expensive for me to find out what all my friends think of something, so I'm going to have somebody else who stands as a proxy for that trust. Now you can find out who you've... And you don't just find out about those friends. I'm old enough to be a retired hippie, and I like going to 60s and 70s concerts. I didn't realize that meant listening to people in their 60s and 70s perform on stage. but that's what I do with a lot of my leisure time. But today, when I buy a ticket, I can choose whether I go on Saturday or Sunday and where I sit, because by allowing my social login, my network to be shared with the service provider, I have the ability to be able to say, oh, these people are going on Saturday, these people are going on Sunday, shall I sit near or shall I sit far away? All these choices are available because I live in that connected world. The problem with being connected is you get a fire hose. Fire hoses don't get solved unless you learn how to deal with the log jam. It needs filters. Clay Shirky, one of my favorite professors, said there is no such thing as information overload. There is only filter failure. So designing filters is something that every one of us needs to consider doing in terms of providing what a customer needs and wants. The dream of saying customers get what they want, where they want it, when they want it, how they want it, only takes place when you provide customer side, not publisher side, filters to be able to make those choices happen. To be able to make sure the right information gets to the right person at the right time, there are very many filters that didn't exist in the past, and we need to understand them. The like, the RT, the +1 is a prioritization. It's a filter. It's a way of making sure that that which is important rises up to the surface. It's not like email, broadcast mechanism, where you have to go through everything or nothing. Here, if you miss something in a stream, the network makes sure that that which is important in the stream surfaces back up. That's a huge transformation. Understanding how that network works. Location-based services we've spoken about since probably the mid-90s. I remember all the failures of the late 90s in this, but now we're really beginning to get serious about it. The idea of geofencing has become important. Giving people information that is valuable to where they are is one of the ways of providing that filter, but allowing the person to choose where they are. Multiple devices are useful, but all the information doesn't go to all the devices. You need to understand that when we live in this kind of world, anybody who wants a PowerPoint presentation or a spreadsheet sent to their watch or to their glass, doesn't need help in the traditional form. They need counseling. Okay? They need prayer, perhaps. Because we are going to have to understand these devices work in different social constructs. It's one thing for you to look quietly at your watch to find out whether you've got an urgent message. It's another thing altogether for you to be able to take your phablet out of your sort of coat pocket and start looking at it in the middle of a party. You're not going to do that. So the form factor of the device helps determine where you're going to be able to access that device, which means that routing things to the right device at the right time becomes important. And that's, again, a choice that the customer, if you think customer, you need to build these. If this and that is effectively the best compendium of effective conditional routing recipes, and you should go take a look there if you haven't already, because this is part and parcel of how to build things that are truly customer-centric. Understanding that metadata's cost is cheap. It's now knowing what device, what person, what location, what environment condition, what time. This is just an EXIF file for a single photograph loaded up to Flickr. But the cost of how the data comes wrapped with context has again dropped sharply, and using metadata to do the filtering is critical. Understanding how to shift time has become part and parcel of how customers want their filtering, because they may not want things at broadcast time. They're choosing when, and the ability to choose when is again part of how design has to be brought into place. All this gets brought together with an understanding that people now live in a stream. When I started work, I used to have green screens with character-driven access to menus. Then everything started looking a bit like Excel. Then everything started looking a bit like a mailbox. Then everything started looking like Facebook. We go through these changes, but understanding today, people live in the feed. And it's not just living in the feed, but the feed has become a semi-permeable membrane. You need APIs to allow people to build services to extract data out of the field safely and securely, and you need publishers to be able to drop services into the feed, because all these feeds have to represent ecosystems. The idea of monolithic architectures is now so much in the past, because at one time when the theory of the firm ruled strong in Ronald Coase terms, people concentrated on reducing unit costs. and you then built monolithic architectures, layer upon layer of sophistication, and at some point, the cost of change exceeded the value of change. I don't know how many telcos I want to speak to where it doesn't matter what question you ask, the answer is, 3 to 30 million and 18 months minimum for whatever you wanted to do. Repaint the sign in front of the toilet. Okay? Because the architecture of the firm had already had those sophistications. Changing that means shifting from monoliths to ecosystem, worrying about the cost of change at the same time as worrying about unit costs. Sometimes worrying about the cost of change more than unit costs, because that is how you're going to get the ability to respond at market speed. But all this still comes back to one question, listening to the customer. If the customer is talking because the customer is connected, can talk, and you're not there listening, you're not there actually hearing what the customer has got to say. And sometimes what that customer has got to say is not necessarily what you expect when they live in the stream. I want to go through 3 cases and then go back quickly. Netflix, on one hand, is busy unbundling and busy extracting advertising while other people are trying to bundle and advertise. Neither is right or wrong, but understand the customer and the expectation. Rovio, when I spoke to the founders, said something that was fascinating for me. That was, Angry Birds was their 53rd game. The first 52 games that they had, in order to get distribution, they had to negotiate with 180 different operators, all of whom felt that 75% was the right kind of ratio of revenue that the operator should keep, and all of them felt that Rovio knew nothing about the customer, that they were the ones who understood who the customer was. Along comes somebody like Apple, and now it's negotiating with one group of people at a much different rate. The point I'm trying to make is all the APIs in the world, all the architecture in this world is not enough if you don't solve the engaging and contracting point. When the distance to the customer has shortened, you also have to make sure the distance to the ecosystem shortens. You've got to reduce barriers to entry to all of them. You have a choice. Kodak knew everything about their customer, knew everything about their product, knew everything about everything. So did Polaroid. And yet, at the same quarter that the two of them reached their end of bankruptcy, a company with 30-odd people, 18 months old, whose job appeared to be to make Kodak look like Polaroid, got bought for $1 billion. Why? Because they were customer first, product second. Understanding being customer first is a critical part of this world. Understanding what that happens in a connected world is going to be part and parcel of where we're heading, because wearables are becoming part of our lives, the Internet of everything is part of our lives, but behind every tweet, every device, every action is a customer. Every time we have to bring it back to the customer. I love what the music industry is beginning to learn, that the customer is not the artist but the fan. There are, the last time I looked, more fans than there were artists. Figure out who your customers are and who you're trying to serve. In doing that, listening to the customer also means learning when to back off. And with that, I'm going to back off, sit down, talk to Chris. Thank you for your time.
Well, JP, you promised me you'd race through those slides and keep us moving, and thank you for doing that. The obvious question, given your background and the role that you've had within a traditional incumbent telco and now within what we call an OTT, but a new generational player, is what do you see as the main differences? You've given us some indications in there, but how stark do you see the differences between your current world and your previous world?
Okay, well, I've enjoyed working in both, so this is trying to be as objective as possible in the answer. When I told people I was joining a telco, leaving the bank some years ago, I received a bunch of SMSs, which roughly translated to, could you please fix my broadband, except that could you please was not actually used in the message.
Yeah.
And when I told people I worked for the telco, the reaction was neutral to negative, right? There wasn't a sense of they wanting to hug me. Right?
perhaps
when I joined,
to attack you rather than hug you, perhaps.
Yeah, but they were kind enough not necessarily to throw things at me, but so we say the reaction was neutral, negative when I described what I was. And after joining Salesforce, when I tell people where I work, the normal reaction is a smile. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, it's hard, it's unfair, but it's reality that many of the organizations that come from a utility frame of mind are not necessarily liked by customers, and solving that becomes a not easy thing to do. And that was the first shift. I was so used to people using swear words, wanting me to fix things, being neutral to negative in looking at what I did, to switching to saying, smiling, oh, that's what you're doing, great, etc. So, you know, that itself meant a change that, you know, I couldn't have predicted.
But it's sort of interesting, isn't it, that all of the changes that you described, you know, whether it's Netflix or Salesforce.com, whatever, that they all drive much more utilization of that network. And the role of the telecom player or a cable player or whatever, satellite, becomes so embedded in our daily lives, whether that's for our personal or our business use. So how do we, you know, if you were to be transplanted back today into the telecom world, what would be the first things that you would instigate within what you call the utility provider? What do you think needs changing fundamentally within?
I don't know, you know, years ago I used to joke that and I even tried it, you know, I would ring a telco up and say, I want to pay my bill. And they said, sure, what account number? Yeah. Might as well say, I don't actually know my account number. I know my, you know, my name, my date of birth, my address, my telephone number. What's this account number? And the idea that I could not part with money that I wanted to give them unless I knew a whole series of hieroglyphics that were only relevant to them is a statement that says the systems were designed for back-end processing rather than customer engaging. Yeah. And this is not just true in telco, it's true in, you know, why would you want to remember an insurance policy number, an account number, a transaction number? I mean, that is not the way you engage with the customer. Customers are human beings. So transforming engagement to say, not a token of the back office process, right, but a recognition of the person is sort of step one to me. Mm.
And Keith mentioned in his introduction with David the how-to reports that we've just been producing, and the one I've been working on is the notion of agility both within business and IT. And we talk about going back to the roots of what the product portfolio should be, the process, the systems, and then getting to the customer. I mean, can you start with the customer and go back in and change the systems, or have you?
Well, I think, you know, if you look at, say, what happened with Amazon and its, you know, competitors, switching something as basic as whether you're product-centric or customer-centric from one to the other is non-trivial. It's not an exercise in presentation. Mm-hmm. So unless you truly read it, you know, I think it took Barnes & Noble a few years to even be able to conceive of what it meant to say one item to one address with no intermediate distribution points, with inventory, reorder levels, etc. And the same becomes true to saying if you want to be customer-centric, the architecture has to switch. One of those switches has got to be this monolith to ecosystem, because the agility point you were making, unless you can change at customer pace, you're not going to be able to stay with the market. There's no point being a, you know, the agile sense of startups isn't that a smaller organization is always going to make decisions faster and act faster. You know, I like to think of us as a 15-year-old startup. It's the way you make decisions. And all our decisions are around the customer. You know, every complaint we deal with, every issue we raise, every time we're dealing with new product or service, every time we want to understand what the market's doing, it begins and ends with the customer, because it's in the DNA of the firm.
Okay, and for those of you, when you look at the agility report, you see we have gone back and realized you have to go back and re-engineer, almost reverse engineer a lot of the processes and the organization.
Well, the monolith to ecosystem argument, you know, while I made the point to say it's not enough just to have the APIs, you've got to change the contracting. You know, agility is it's not just in the technology, it's in the business process, it's in the corporate strategy, it's in the way people think and feel. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, Chris.
And we were talking a little bit before we came on stage about some of the economist theory. I know and every economist has a different theory about the world, but there are two fundamental camps at the moment. One which says that the digital world is destroying a lot of traditional value, or the other one says it's creating a lot of value. I mean, who's going to benefit from it? Is it the customer's going to benefit, and therefore it's how the industry's moved to address that customer requirement? Where do you see that?
Well, obviously, as we discussed, I've seen both. And, it's too facile to say it's just one extreme or the other. We currently see value creation in a number of areas. We also see value destruction in a number of areas. And, I'm waiting to see the real transformation that would take place in the places that need it the most right now, and, in healthcare and education, in government welfare in general.
Across the board.
But at the same token, I also recognize we live in a world where you could be listening to tweets that, I could, just to give you two quick examples, I travel a lot, I have an Indian passport, I have to keep a lot of visas with me, and I forgot the visa booklet that had my German visa. I turned up in Germany, and the guy said, no visa, no entry. I said, look, I have a visa, it's just not with me. He said, unless I can see it, no entry. And he agreed that my daughter could photograph the visa on my passport on my desk, email it to me, and actually email it to him directly, and I was let in. Okay? My jaw nearly broke with the shock.
Yeah.
But that kind of world, to say that it's okay, you will have wireless connection almost anywhere you go. It's become normal. Right? People will start realizing that the brilliant things that we can do won't happen unless the infrastructure is there. But we have to get to a point where the people who build that infrastructure have been making the architectural changes that Keith was talking about, that you allude to in the Agility Report. While they don't come for free, they can come either because there is an abundance in the engagement model or a scarcity mindset in the engagement model. And I think the abundance mindset is yet to hit many of the utilities in this world, because coming from a monopoly background, there's still time to be taken to tear the monopoly roots out. It doesn't come easily.
No, and I think that's the fundamental argument, isn't it? That the utilities have in the past been monopolies, and they're now having to play in an ecosystem. So they were big fish in a relatively small pond. They're now fish in a big sea, and they're having to compete with people like Salesforce.com, who are delivering service. But I think you mentioned a point earlier about the cost of transformation, and the fact that we've gone through so many layers of building on top of the old traditional telecom network and the systems, so you end up in that customer cul-de-sac that you mentioned, where you just you can't break out. I mean, that cost of transformation, it's a pretty urgent requirement for most of the large organizations now, is it not?
Yeah, but I think the choice is fundamentally not, it's like, do you want to be Kodak or do you want to be Instagram? Is a call that everyone needs to be able to make, because the product-centric, hierarchically minded, focused on unit cost, deep vertical integration, monolithic organization wasn't wrong. It was fit for purpose for a world that doesn't exist today. When the pace of change has transformed that much, when the distance to the customer is reduced that much, and customers have the power to be able to walk, when in so many infrastructures, whether it's in payments, whether it's telecom, whether it's in computing in general, there is an ability for people to come over the top to extract the valuable parts of the value chain while leaving the capital-intensive parts for others to be able to play with. The response to that can be, one, to say, we're going to make it hard for anyone to enter, and therefore get the payback. Because there is an asymmetry. Again, we spoke about this, Chris, about 25-year type cycles for some of the hardware investments, and people being able to go A/B testing on a service that they built in a day and a half. So how do you create an ecosystem that allows those two extremes to operate, that the barriers to entry for someone building a service, introducing it, getting distribution are really low, but the cost of building the infrastructure for that service is long-term and really high. To get to those, we have to stop some of the us and them behavior, some of the conflict, and say that the ecosystem has got to recognize that all boats can float if you can get those sort of waves up to the right level.
Yeah.
And I think we have to move from the conflict type approach that I think we've been experiencing for a while to a much more cooperative ecosystem model.
Yeah, lovely. Well, we've run out of time, but we could talk for many, many hours about this. I think that one of my favorite phrases we came across was the goal of IT is to now reduce the distance between corporate IT and the customer. I think that goes to your point about, the customer is, we always talk about the customer being king, the customer being at the center of things. The customer has so many means of getting to the services they want now that it's about, nobody owns the customer is the fulcrum, the focal point, and the organizational shift, both with the individual organization, but also with the ecosystem, to allow other people to get close to the customer is exactly what
absolutely. I mean, I think of, every day of the work that the people around me do, what I'm part of, is reducing friction and latency between our customers and their customers.
Oiling the wheels.
Every day.
Yeah. JP Rangaswamy, thank you very much for kicking us off this morning. Thank you very much.
Chris, a pleasure as always. Thank you.